the Soviet Union, North Korea, China, and Cuba. All those countries have one thing in common. They experienced socialism and it failed. In the case of the Soviet Union, the country collapsed and completely disappeared. In the case of China, they decided to open the country to capitalism in the 1990s. And in North Korea and Cuba, the living standards are very low, by any measure. And here I am mentioning only 4 countries that tried socialism and failed. There's the case of all the countries in the Warsaw Pact, such as East Germany and Poland. There's also Yugoslavia, Vietnam, and Laos. In all those countries, socialism was either completely dropped and replaced by capitalism, or it failed to deliver what it promised. And I should make one thing clear. Here I am talking about hardcore and strict socialism, that is, communism, the kind of regime that was implemented in the Soviet Union or that is currently ruling North Korea. When I say the word socialism, I am not talking about Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn, Scandinavian countries, or Venezuela. Those people and countries, they either call themselves socialist or other people label them as socialist. But we will see that in a minute, they are not real socialists. One may wonder, why did socialism fail each and every time? What is the pattern behind every failure? Well, that is what we are going to find out in this episode of Money Talk. Let's dive in. Before getting started, please hit the subscribe button down there and activate the notification bell to never miss a new video. As always, to understand socialism, and more precisely communism, a little bit of context is needed. Please note that in this video, I will focus on the practical aspect of socialism, that is, the economic application. I won't focus too much into the ideology. You may have noticed that I use socialism and communism as synonyms, but this isn't precise. I use them as synonyms because they are the same from a pure economic standpoint, but there are some slight differences that I will talk about later in the video. All that being said, let us start. Economics have been created to find a solution to a big problem, called the economic problem. Every country faces the same problem. There is a scarce amount of resources and a much bigger amount of needs and wants from the population. When you ask the population, everybody wants, of course, basic goods, such as food, clothing, healthcare, education, and a shelter. But when those needs are met and satisfied, everybody wants much more. Everybody wants to have several nice cars, a big house, nice vacations, and so on. It is said that the needs and wants of the population are illimited. But here is the problem. There are not enough resources to satisfy all those needs and wants, hence the economic problem. And when we look at resources, there is another problem. Most of the resources are not usable as they are. Cars, for example, don't grow on trees. We have to take those resources and transform them into goods usable by the population. That is called production. And that is the economic problem. A scarce amount of resources, such as land, wood, oil, and steel, that needs to be transformed through production to satisfy a much bigger amount of needs and wants of the population. And to solve the economic problem, we have to answer 3 questions. And the first question is, what to produce? Should we produce cars? If so, how many? Should we produce shirts? If so, how many? Should we produce books? If so, how many? And then the second question is, how do we produce? How do we organize the work in the factory? Where do we put the factory? Who will be in charge of the factory? What will be the wages of the workers in the factory? The how we produce is basically how we organize the means of production. And remember that. Remember means of production because it is important. And finally comes the third question, for whom? When we made 1 million books, how many of them go to schools? How many of them go to the government? How many of them go to the general public? Those are the 3 questions to answer to solve the economic problem. And there are 2 ways to answer those 3 questions. The first way is called the market economy, also known as capitalism, and the second way is called the planned economy, also known as socialism. Let's start with capitalism. In a market economy, there are many decentralized markets that answer the 3 questions we mentioned below. For every good, there is a market with buyers and sellers who are individuals who act independently. There is a market for books with a lot of individual book buyers, and there are also a lot of booksellers, several bookmakers who manufacture the books, and those book manufacturers are competing against each other to provide the lowest price as possible. And it is the interactions between many buyers and many sellers that will determine the price of books without the intervention of anybody. And the market economy is possible thanks to private property. It means that everything has an owner, who only the owner can use, and also that applies to the means of productions, that is, factories. To take back the book example, there are some individuals who own the book factories. Those are the business owners, those who control the means of production, also called the capitalists. Those capitalists own the book factory because they were the ones to invest the money to buy the factory, buy the machines, and buy the tools to make the books. Today, the vast majority of countries have a market economy, and it was also the case for Western countries in the 19th century, when the concept of socialism was first formalized. The abstract idea of socialism had been around for very long, from antiquity, but in the 19th century, two men, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, formalized the ideology and also dictated how it should be implemented in practice. More specifically, Karl Marx wrote a book called Das Kapital, and Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx together wrote another book called The Communist Manifesto. Those two books are considered to have created socialism. They are the Bible of socialism. In those books, we can see a harsh critique of the market economy, that is, capitalism. It is said that the capitalist system generates two classes of people: those who own the capital, in other words, the means of production, and everybody else, the workers. The capitalists who own the means of production are all the factory owners, the landowners, and the landlords, who make money without working, by profiting from their wealth. And to make money, those capitalists hire and exploit workers to do the manual and unpleasant work for them. And the capitalists reap off all the reward of the efforts made by the workers and give them just enough to barely survive. And there is some reality in those observations. Back then, the conditions, working and life conditions of workers were much worse than what we have today. Factory work was very dangerous. They had to work for more than 14 hours and they had just enough to barely survive, just to eat and have a shelter. Marx and Engels called this unfair treatment the class struggle, where the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, oppresses the workers, the proletarians. The solution Marx and Engels found to that problem is simple. Instead of having a market economy for the economic problem, we replace it with a planned economy, with a central planner, the state that answers the three problems: what to produce, how to produce it, and for whom. The private property is eliminated. The land, the real estate, and the factories belong to everybody through state ownership, a state that owns everything. And as a result, there are no more social classes. And if there are no more social classes, there is no more class struggle. In a socialist country, everybody has a job, free housing, free education, and free healthcare. And all the other goods are not organized in markets anymore. The state decides which quantity to produce and also determines the price so that every transaction is fair. Or that's what they say on paper. And here comes the little difference between socialism and communism. Under socialism, the markets and the private property is abolished in a democratic way because the people vote to do so. However, under communism, the private property and the markets are suppressed using an authoritarian regime that implements a dictatorship that suppresses individual liberties. That is why communism is called the dictatorship of proletarians. And all those people who call themselves socialists, such as Bernie Sanders or the Scandinavian countries, are not really socialists. They call themselves socialists because they took some concept of socialism, such as free healthcare or free education, but they don't have the intention to suppress private property or to suppress markets. To be precise, those people are social democrats. They want to stay in a capitalist system, but take some concepts from socialism. But let's come back to communism. Communism was first implemented in real life in 1917 in the Russian Empire that became the Soviet Union, and then it spread to China, Vietnam, North Korea, and other places. And back then, the promises of communism was very appealing to a lot of people. But let me tell you, communism has a lot of flaws. As I said at the beginning of the video, communism is just a shadow of what it once was. In 1980, 35% of the world population lived under communism. Today, a mere 2% of the world population lives under communism in just 4 countries: Cuba, Laos, Vietnam, and North Korea. The standards of living in those countries is very low. A simple picture comparing South Korea and North Korea during the night is enough to prove it. And most important of all, the representative country of communism, the archetype of communism, the Soviet Union, collapsed 30 years ago, in 1991. We can also say that communism failed from a moral perspective, by violently repressing and killing millions and millions of innocent people. Of course, all those victims are a huge tragedy, but here we're going to focus on the economic failures of communism. That being said, let's talk about the failures of socialism. There are 3 factors that are commonly cited as the reasons why socialism fails. Very often, I will take the Soviet Union as an example because it is very well documented. The reason behind socialist failure that we hear the most often is that under a communist regime, people do not have any incentive to do productive work. Under communism, everybody was sure to have a job and everybody was paid more or less the same. But in that case, why would you work hard? Why would you work hard if there are, first of all, no reward for working hard and there are no consequences if you don't work hard? Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx were convinced that the workers would be eager to work hard for nothing to benefit the nation, to benefit the collective well-being. Well, if people were 100% altruistic, that would work. But sadly, people are much more selfish. And people ask always this question: what's in it for me? And under communism, when people asked, what's in it for me if I work hard? The answer was almost nothing. As a result, the productivity in the Soviet Union was low, and there was a running joke that in Soviet factories there are always 5 people working and 5 others playing cards. So there were bad incentives for the workers, but there were also bad incentives for the directors, the men running the factories. In a capitalist country, the people running a factory have one single objective: making a profit. The expenses must be lower than the revenues. Otherwise, if the company loses money, it's very simple. The company goes bankrupt, all the workers are laid off, and the people running the company lose their investments. It's very hard, but it works. Because remember, we always do more to avoid pain than we will do to gain pleasure. And as a result, the directors running factories in a capitalist society have a very good incentive to be efficient, to use the resources efficiently, whether that is raw materials or workers. And because there is a lot of competition, they also have the incentive to make good products that will be satisfactory to the customers. In a communist country, things are very different. Because remember, the factory is owned by the government, so it cannot go bankrupt. The government cannot go bankrupt. And also, they don't have any competition. There is only one single factory manufacturing the same products. And a communist factory director didn't need to pay for any resources. If he wanted more men or more resources, he just had to ask the central government for more, and they would send it for free. For example, if the director running the Lada factory, the Soviet car, wanted more tires to make more cars, he just needed to ask the central government for more tires, and he would receive them for free. That is not a very good incentive to use things efficiently, and as a result, there were a lot of shortages and inefficiencies and wasted materials. To take back the example of the Lada director, he could not tell to the workers to be less lazy and to work more and more efficiently. Because remember, we were in a communist country. It is the dictatorship of the proletarians. The rulers are the workers. And if the director became too harsh on the workers, he would be immediately fired in the best case, and in the worst case, sent to the gulag. As a result, if the director needed more manpower, he had to hire more people, which incentivized the existing worker and the new workers to be even more lazy. But at the end of the day, the director didn't really care about this, because he didn't have to pay for the workers, the government did. Because of all of those inefficiencies and wasting, there was a lot of shortage of manpower, raw materials, and then shortage of products. There was even a running joke in the Soviet Union that said that if the Soviet Union was a desert, it would need to buy sand to foreign countries. Communist countries have the tendency to enter into shortages and inefficiency spirals, with scarcity bringing even more scarcity that brings even more scarcity. And at the end of the day, there is no incentive at all for people to work hard, bringing even more scarcity. The second reason why socialism fails is interesting, because it is a leadership problem I talked about in my last video about Jocko Willink, the former Navy SEAL. In that video, I mentioned how important it is to use decentralized planning and decentralized command to be successful. And in communist countries, they do exactly the opposite. The command and the planning is completely centralized. Those countries are ruled by one single political party, the Communist Party. And that Communist Party decides about absolutely everything in the country. In the Soviet Union, they decided what number of cars to produce, what amount of sugar to produce, what amount of books to produce. In short, they decide about the production of everything. And most importantly, the price of goods was also set by the central government. And they set a price that was very low, intentionally, so that everybody could afford the product. But the problem when you set a price that is below the market price is that you create shortages. Yes, even more shortages. In the Soviet Union, the direct consequence of that policy were empty grocery stores and the scarcity of many products. There were very long waiting lines for everything, and in some cases, the only way to buy the necessary goods to survive was the black market, where those who sold those products illegally set a very high price, squeezing even more the slim budget of the Soviet population. That is the unavoidable consequence of ultra-centralized planning. But imagine that yourself, that you're sitting at your desk and you have to decide about the quantity of cars to produce in your country, the quantity of potatoes to produce, the quantity of shirts to produce, the quantity of books to produce, and at which price. It would certainly be overwhelming and you would certainly make a lot of mistakes. In a capitalist society, it is millions and millions of people who take small-scale decisions in decentralized markets, and those markets will define the amount of goods to produce and at which price. Yes, during the Cold War, almost everything was more expensive in the US, but at least it was there. There were no shortages. The third reason socialism fails is the concentration of power. Because in communist countries, there is no competition at all. There is no competition for politicians and no competition for factories. Everything was pretty bad. Their cars, their cigarettes, and their houses. And when it comes to politicians, it's the same thing. They have no competition. They're unelected, they know they cannot be removed, and they have all the power. So if somebody is not happy with what they're doing, go to Gulag. In a democratic country, politicians have a good incentive to do a good job because they must be re-elected. If they do a bad job, they will not be re-elected at the next term. That reminds me somebody. In the Soviet Union, the bureaucracy was huge, full of people who were unelected, could not be removed, and had all the power. As a result, if you wanted to do anything in the Soviet Union, you had to bribe government officials. The corruption was rampant. You want to move to another city. You live currently in Moscow and you want to move to Leningrad, for example. Well, you have to be transferred to another job. You have to find an empty apartment that is all owned by the state. You have to fill in a lot of paper and a bureaucrat has to approve all of this. And the bureaucrat would often tell you this: "Don't worry, comrade, I can take care of all of this. But you know, these kind of services, they're not free. I will need a little something, if you see what I mean." The bureaucracy in the USSR was so enormous that the simple fact of repairing a hole in the street was nearly impossible. There are so many people involved in the decision-making process that this hole was never repaired, and the streets of the Soviet Union were often in a sorry state. To conclude all of this, the Soviet population had a meager wage set by the states. They had to pay very high prices because the grocery stores owned by the government were empty, and they had to bribe the officials all the time to do basic things, and at the end of the day, they were left with nothing. It is understandable that people were sick of that system, and one day decided to throw communism out of the window, as it happened. So there you have the three basic flaws that dooms communism to fail each and every time. and why communism has almost completely disappeared today. But, by contrast, has capitalism succeeded? But that is a topic for another video. I hope you liked this video. If that is the case, a little thumbs up is always appreciated. If there is a topic you want me to cover in a future video, you can shoot me an email to the address that is in the description below, and I will see you very soon for a next episode. In the meantime, take care.